The subcommittee is called to order. This afternoon's hearing is on the topic that I consider to be of great importance: the sharing and management of water across international borders. When well done, both the environment and the people
important issues we have to contend with. So I'd also like to thank our witnesses, in particular, Kathleen Cunast. Kathleen testified before the full committee on the role of women in conflict prevention, and I welcome her back to the committee today. I appreciate your being here, as I do all our witnesses. Today's hearing topic provides us with an opportunity to look beyond Europe and Eurasia and examine the global impact of depleting resources, climate change, an expanding world population, and accompanying social unrest. Last year, for the first time, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, listed, quote, competition and scarcity involving natural resources, unquote, as a national security threat on par with global terrorism, cyber warfare, and nuclear proliferation. He also noted that terrorists, militants, and international crime groups are certain to use declining local food security to gain legitimacy and undermine government authority. And that's what we have to look at if this goes unchanged in the future. I'd add that the prospect of scarcities of vital natural resources, including energy, water, land, food, and rare earth elements, in itself would guarantee geopolitical friction. Now add lone wolves and extremists who exploit these scenarios into the mix, and the domestic relevance of today's conversation becomes clear. Further, it's no secret that threats are more interconnected today than they were, let's say, 15 years ago. Events which at first seem local and irrelevant have the potential to set off transnational disruptions and affect U.S. national interests. At the same rate, issues of mutual concern provide the opportunity for greater cooperation, and projects that encourage community building and environmental awareness at the local level are taking place and should be encouraged. In particular, I believe that the women in communities threatened by water scarcity will have an important role to play in the future and should be engaged by their local governments and international communities now. I agree with Mr. Clapper that the depletion of resources stemming from many factors, which above all include climate change, has the potential to raise a host of issues for U.S. businesses, officials, and individuals abroad, as well as here at home. For this reason, Mr. Chairman, I have long advocated for alternative energy sources. Yet, as the representative of what will be hopefully one day the nation's first offshore wind farm, I deal daily with obstructive businesses and individuals trying to get in the way of this project and others like it in exchange for increasing their company's profit margins. I'd like to add that given our distinguished panel of witnesses today and our subcommittee's jurisdiction, I'm sure we'll be hearing about the tremendous energy reserves in Central Asia and the need for diversifying energy markets. In this regard, I'd like to note that I'll have and will continue to advocate for the importance of increasing democratic governance and rule of law in that region. Energy production can get you only so far. I'd like to hear from our witnesses on how the United States can engage with Central Asian governments to improve governance, transparency, and in the energy sector, both bilaterally and through international organizations, such as the Extractive Industries Transparencies Initiatives. However, as we discuss these important issues, I hope that we can continue to keep our own country's movement toward an energy-independent future and the obstacles on this path in our minds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I knew you'd get a global warming in there somewhere. It's okay. Mr. Meeks, would you like to share an opening statement with us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inequitable access to fresh water is highly variable between and within countries, and much of the world's population lives in places where demand for water exceeds supply. International water shortages are a critical issue with far-reaching effects on global security and stability. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I'm thankful to you and the ranking member for convening such a timely hearing today to address this very, very important topic. An increasing prevalence of water shortages and the subsequent threats to peace these shortages present are fundamentally a global trend. Indeed, even here in the United States of America, we are not immune from this problem. As some of my colleagues, and you may very well know, there was just a program on 60 Minutes out west talking about how well the groundwater is being depleted even in the United States. So America has a stake in this issue just like every other country, and we must realize that all of our futures are dependent upon the actions that we take now. We have to look at this problem from a geopolitical perspective and understand the complex relations which exist between nations and places like East Africa and Central Asia. Many of their disputes over water go back decades, if not longer. We must also look at this from a human perspective, because at the end of the day, it is ultimately about human life. Every year, 2.1 million people, mainly children, die due to illness related to dirty water, poor sanitation, and poor hygiene. 1/3 of the world's population lives in water-stressed countries, primarily in Asia and Africa. The actions we take today hold the potential to eliminate human suffering tomorrow and promote peace and cooperation for generations to come. We must think long and hard about how we avoid conflict. We must discuss ways we can advance science and put it to work in the service of mankind. And most importantly, we must collectively discuss how we can use diplomacy, both here in the United States as well as abroad, to promote fair, reasonable, responsible, and sustainable strategies for cooperation among our friends and partners around the world. For indeed, this place that we call Earth is small, and we share it with each other, and we need to preserve it for each other. Otherwise, we are all subject to perish. So I'm grateful again to the chairman and the ranking member, and I'm grateful to our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses on this very, very important matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, and I will give a brief introduction to our witnesses. And our first witness is Dr. Paul Sullivan, and he is a professor of economics at the National Defense University. For 6 years, Dr. Sullivan taught classes at the American University in Cairo. He obtained his PhD from Yale University, has advised senior U.S. officials and others on many issues related to energy, water, food, economics, politics, and political security issues. Next, we have Amanda Wooden, Dr. Amanda Wooden, who is an associate professor and director of environmental studies at Bucknell University. She earned her PhD in international relations and public policy at Claremont Graduate University in California, nearby my home turf. Dr. Wooden served with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as an economic and environmental officer in Kyrgyzstan. And finally, we have Dr. Kathleen Kienost, who is the director of the Center for Gender and Peace Building at the United States Institute of Peace. She is an expert on Central Asia and Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan in particular, where for over a decade she worked as a social scientist for the World Bank, with a focus, of course, on Central Asian conflict prevention. So we're very, very blessed to have you with us today. We thank you for taking your time and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I would ask if you could try to keep it to a 5-minute summary. Everything else that you would like to have in a more developed way, you could put into the record as part of your testimony. And with that, Dr. Sullivan, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member William Keating from my home state of Massachusetts, the Honorable Majority and Minority Members of the Subcommittee, Mr. Meeks. It's an honor and a privilege to be giving testimony on this extremely interesting issue. I heard national security mentioned. This is also involved with economics, politics, geopolitics, diplomacy, possibly the military, and also human security. And without the human security of water, food, and energy security, terrorism, and other things can result. Before I give any public presentation, I need to give the usual caveats. These are my opinions alone and do not represent the university, National Defense University, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, Georgetown, or any other institution I might be associated with. I will focus mostly on the Blue Nile with the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD in Ethiopia, with its potential effects on downstream countries, especially Egypt, and the Omo River, with the Gibi Dam cascade, and especially Gibi 3 Dam, and the effects on Lake Turkana in Kenya, and also in Ethiopia. These dam systems are way along the way, even as these tensions build. When water is at threat, then energy, food, industry, and more are also at threat, including peace and stability. Severe water shortages can breed poverty, hopelessness, terrorism, and even revolution, as we saw in Syria with the horrible droughts in 2008 through 2010, essentially sparking off their revolution. The GERD Dam is built on the Blue Nile, or Abe as it's called in the region. Egypt uses about 98% of its available water. It is already water stressed. Water shortages in Egypt built up some tensions leading to the revolution and beyond. Egypt has 55 cubic kilometers of the Nile water for its allocation from a 1959 treaty, which Ethiopia does not recognize. They and others, except for Sudan, have signed on to another treaty, which they recognize. 55 cubic kilometers seems like a lot of water. However, for a population close to 90 million, it really is not. They are living on a knife's edge of water security. When the reservoir behind the GERD is filled, it could contain 75 cubic kilometers of water, which is much greater than Egypt's Nile-designated amounts. It's also 1/2 of the entire water in Lake Nasser, which is the only buffer Egypt has if there is a great shortage of water upstream. The Blue Nile gives Egypt about 60 to 70% of all of its water, depending on seasonal water flows. It's very important to understand that the real time to develop water, or when it rains the most in this part of the world, is June through September. And that will likely be when the GERD Dam is filled up, but it's also a time, think June to September in Egypt, when it's very hot. Also great needs for electricity. In the 1980s, there were famines and droughts in Ethiopia. About 1 million people died. At the same time, the water heading toward Egypt was cut back. And when it was cut back, the electricity production from hydro dams in Egypt was also cut back. There was a problem with irrigation. There was a problem with food. Egypt and Ethiopia are intimately connected through the Nile. What happens in Ethiopia can really affect what's happening in Egypt. If the GERD Dam is filled up too quickly and at the wrong time, Egypt could go beyond that knife's edge in security. This is possibly a nightmarish situation for many Egyptians. They're quite concerned. If they were around in the 1980s, they knew what happened then. It's not clear how this dam is going to be filled up. It's not clear from any of the studies. As a matter of fact, no real studies have been done of this. A lot of ideas have been bantered about way this might work out. But the behavior of the Ethiopian government on the Omo River with regard to the Gibi Cascade is a giveaway. They could care less, it seems, about what happens to Lake Turkana in Kenya or of the tribals along the river, the Omo River. They've essentially tossed them off their land, and there's a huge land grab happening right now. The Ethiopians have claimed that they're not going to be using the GERD Reservoir water for irrigation. However, if there is another famine, I can guarantee you they will. and Egypt will be in trouble. Because just letting the water go through for electricity is very different from using that water for irrigation. It takes more and more of it out. There has to be some way to come to some agreement before it gets worse, before populations grow, before economic demands grow, before agriculture grows along the river. International law in this case is quite weak. There is no enforcement mechanism. You have the Helsinki Agreements, the Berlin Agreements, you have Article 7 of the UN Convention, the Nile Basin Agreement, and so forth. But without an enforcement agreement, we're really going nowhere with this. Part of what may be needed, and this is where the United States may walk in, is that we try to help develop with our allies and partners and many others in the world an enforcement mechanism for these treaties and new treaties to take a look at a better way of sharing water. If we don't do that, the situation will get more tense along the Nile and many other places in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, Member Meek, and other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. In Central Asia, the main water disputes concern the water-energy nexus, but a direct relationship between water scarcity and interstate conflict is an unlikely scenario. There are already existing contentious water politics within several countries in the region, and these combine, and most recently are combining with finger-pointing between Central Asian leaders, who at times have used nationalistic rhetoric and threats about water to influence other political issues. However, existing cooperation, even within the current weak institutional regional water-sharing network, means that conflict is avoidable. So to help strengthen cooperation, the U.S. government should expand support for renewable energy development and electricity distribution, help tackle pernicious pollution problems, continue and expand support for scientific research in and about the region, and increase support for climate change mitigation and adaptation. The most important regional water tensions and social discontent issues are hydroelectric dam development, irrigation management, infrastructure failures, militarized border zone water sharing, and flooding potential. The Aral Sea ecosystem collapse is a significant livelihood threat. The biggest future water supply risks are glacier loss and precipitation changes, as well as hidden creeping pollution problems and industrialization. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan currently face significant adaptive capacity limitations, and all countries need to better tackle rural vulnerabilities and deal with citizens' everyday water challenges. The glacier-fed rivers Sir Darya and Amu Darya, the main rivers in the region, terminate in the former Aral Sea, which, as the chairman already described, was once the world's fourth largest lake and now is only 10% of its former size. Most recent NASA images show the largest lake portion no longer exists. I gave you an appendix of images, of about 15 images, that show you the map of the region and what this transition looks like. The Aral Sea collapse and continuing decline of residents' quality of life, which includes access to fresh water, soil quality loss, shortened growing season length, could contribute to dissent in Uzbekistan, and this is important to understand. The ongoing disagreements between Central Asian governments over the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya, and seasonal tensions in securitized cross-border communities like the Fergana Valley, are the key tension points. There also exist complex functioning relationships from the local to the national level. When we talk about conflict, it's important to recognize that cooperation is more regular than disagreements and tense events, although that cooperation seems fragile at times. So we have moments where paying attention to what can work in cooperation and how we can enhance that is important. The biggest conflict risks in Central Asia are political and economic. Government willingness to tackle everyday struggles with water and power. Authoritarian state treatments of information sharing and dissent and human rights and access to water being one of those. subsequent contention between people and governments about their non-responsive policies, which we see in times of drought and responses, and regional leaders' use of nationalist rhetoric to lay claim to waterways and rationalize particular waterway uses these are the biggest risks. I also would suggest caution when we use danger and risk rhetoric. This language can contribute to already difficult dialogue between Central Asian nations. So more specifically, let me talk about hydroenergy. Around 90% of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan's electricity production is from hydropower. So both countries are investing heavily in reviving Soviet-era plans to expand this sector. Kyrgyzstan is constructing the large Kambarata dams 1 and 2, and 4 smaller dams on the Narin River with the completion date target of 2019. And Tajikistan is heavily investing in the Rogun Dam, which will displace more than 40,000 people. The government of Uzbekistan has seemingly engaged in economic retribution through border securitization and cutting off gas supplies to both countries at various times. The upstream countries perceive this as a direct response to dam construction. Southern Kyrgyzstan's gas has been cut off since spring. So both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan continue to pressure for halting this large dam construction or engaging in regional evaluation of the projects neutrally. They're concerned these dams will impact availability and timing of flow for downstream irrigation-dependent and flood risk communities. However, both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan face the reality of electricity shortages and impact of power outages on their population's well-being and popular discontent. Recent research that I conducted in Kyrgyzstan concerns the 2010 revolution, which was in part sparked by protests about electricity blackouts, partial privatization of this sector, and increase in tariffs. And this year, 2014, is a very similar year to 2008 and 2009 in Kyrgyzstan. Already, blackouts are likely for the winter, tariffs are being discussed, and it is hard to imagine for Kyrgyzstan and also Tajikistan that they would halt the controversial dam construction projects given their severe domestic electricity shortages. So how do we think about tackling this moving forward? There needs to be clarity about how the new Rogun and Rin dams will be operated, or tensions will remain and perhaps increase during dam construction and the reservoir filling period. The CASA 1000 project, to which the US government is contributing to export electricity from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to Afghanistan and Pakistan, is another point of contention. Uzbekistan opposes this project as it arguably depends on these new dams for adequate electricity export. Perhaps one way in which the United States government could help to improve relations is following the International Crisis Group's suggestion to create multiple bilateral agreements instead of the current dysfunctional multilateral agreements. So this has happened between Kazakhstan and China, between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and the Chui-Talas River Commission, and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan could engage in bilateral agreements. Of course, we would hope that Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan would do the same, but those are less likely. A key future change is projected decreases in the Tian Shan and Pamir mountain glacier surface areas and volume over the next few decades. The region will shift from a glacier-dependent hydrological regime to a precipitation-dependent one, resulting in greater variation in water levels seasonally and annually. So adapting to this slow-moving process requires significant international support. I have 5 key policy suggestions. The first is, given this tight relationship between water and energy and regional distribution disputes, as well as household energy insecurity, it's most important to invest in expansion of renewable energy sources, off-grid household energy systems, and related infrastructure. The U.S. Aid Energy Links program works on institutional strengthening and some energy efficiency improvements. However, much more is needed. Second, water pollution is often missed in discussions of conflict, but it's fundamental for tackling everyday problems residents face, and consequentially for addressing and maintaining political stability. For example, US government funding to help address the uranium tailings legacy would be positively received by multiple countries, so it would be cooperation enhancing. That's something we want to return to. Large-scale industrial projects should be monitored, especially, or for example, I can mention the Kuntur gold mine, which is operating on 4 glaciers in the Tian Shan Mountains. There are several glaciers that are actively being mined in the operation of this gold mining facility, and this is something that should be evaluated when we talk about the EITI, for example, that Mr. Keating mentioned. Third, supporting Central Asian glaciology and hydrology research and scientific monitoring is a valuable contribution, and the USAID is considering contributing to the World Bank's Central Asia Hydrometeorology Modernization Program, and I would support this. And finally, glacial decline is already happening and will have clear impacts on regional water distribution. It's necessary to increase funding for mitigation and adaptation, improve and expand programs such as the USAID Wheat Resiliency Program, and tackle this issue more broadly. Thank you very much.
You're next, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, Mr. Meeks, and other members of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. Please note that the views I express today are solely my own and not those of the U.S. Institute of Peace, which does not take policy positions. I want to emphasize 3 points related to Central Asia and water issues. Water is a mismanaged resource, not necessarily a scarce one. Central Asia is not a friendly neighborhood for water management. Given these predicaments, we can ask why there hasn't been more conflict over water in the past and how this might change in the future. According to World Bank estimates, only 21% of water in Central Asia is used effectively. A recent report in the journal Nature found that on average, a person in Turkmenistan consumes 4 times more water than an average American and 13 times more than a Chinese citizen. Certainly, the Soviet centralized state enforced the rules for water allocation among the republics, regulating and maintaining canals, pumping stations, irrigation facilities, dams, and reservoirs. The post-Soviet era, however, brought the creation of 5 Central Asian states, resulting in a predicament where 98% of Turkmenistan's water supply and 91% of Uzbekistan's originates outside their borders. While poor water management and wasteful practices are core issues in Central Asia, the factors that have kept the regional tensions over water and energy resources from spilling over may no longer hold. Consider the demographic challenge of Central Asia. Roughly half the population is under 30 years of age, and most of these young people are worse off than their parents' generation, with higher rates of illiteracy, unemployment, and poor health. Inattention to the needs of this disenfranchised age group increases the risk of local-level conflicts in the individual countries and throughout the region, especially with known extremist groups infiltrating these countries. But also add a widening gap and tension between elites and the poor, weak governance along with the prevalence of patron-client relationships, loyalty, manipulation of formal rules. Add an increasing fear among the local populations that water and energy problems will be resolved at the end of a gun, especially as the number of small arms surge coming up from Afghanistan. Add the fact of the large number of labor migrants from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan leaving empty villages except for their labor widows, as they're often called. We have a security problem. The recent prediction that Central Asia will see slower growth this next year due to the economic stagnation of countries outside the region. And finally, President Karimov's exit, whenever it happens, there will be a change in the dynamics of the region. His autocratic and oppressive governance has held the border tensions in check. However, new leadership may bring uncertainties with regards to containing hostilities. In summary, I'd like to highlight several points for the U.S. government, including Congress, to consider. Support good water data collection and share information with consumers, farmers, businesses, and policymakers alike. Engage young people through small grants and encourage entrepreneurial social marketing and research studies to address overuse of water by fellow citizens. Teach critical problem-solving skills in U.S. training and educational exchange programs with Central Asian youth. Engage women and civil society, as women are often at the nexus of daily water management. And finally, ensure effective conflict management skills at the local and national levels. This is where the U.S. can most effectively contribute by education and training that offers skill-based approaches to negotiation and conflict management. The U.S. Institute of Peace considers conflict a normal condition of human societies. However, much can be done to prevent violent conflict from being the default mechanism for solving the problem at hand. Central Asia deserves American support for conflict prevention. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for your testimony at some of the statistics that you were quoting, both about Egypt's use of water and both Tajikistan and Uzbekistan's use of water that is coming from the outside of their country is just a bit overwhelming from countries like the United States that have so many of our own water resources. Let me note, in California, I'm not sure exactly what percentage of California water comes from the outside, which will lead me to a question about, I guess, is desal being used at all, Dr. Sullivan, in Egypt?
It is being used in the Sinai for some of the hotels and for some of the military bases, and also on the north coast. But part of the problem is that about 98% of the population of Egypt lives on the Nile, and the Nile stretches all the way to the Sudan from the Mediterranean, and you can't desalinate the Nile. What you'd have to do is have huge pipeline systems set up to bring the desalinated water from either the Mediterranean or from the Red Sea or from other parts of...
isn't Cairo near the ocean?
Well, it's actually many miles from the ocean.
That's interesting, yes.
It's a good 2.5-hour drive to get to Alexandria from Cairo. And for that water to move from the Mediterranean Sea to Cairo would be extremely expensive infrastructurally. And also it takes a lot of energy. If they set up solar desalinization plants, that may be a better way of doing things. They already have a shortage of gas. They're a net importer of oil. A country that, when I was living there in the 1990s, was a country that was hoping for great exports of oil and natural gas.
Also, what we're talking about is projecting what could be but what isn't. And I would say my own observation of how close things are, how far things are away, it all depends on your perspective. And being 2 hours from the ocean may or may not be a long way for certain societies.
Well, in LA, that's just across the corner.
That's right.
But at Cairo, the traffic is difficult, but I'm talking about on a Friday morning during an Eid. It's a long distance.
Mm-hmm. We actually get our water from a lot of water from the Colorado River, but we also now have made a large investment in developing new desal technology, which may have an impact on the Egyptian problem, because at least it could provide some areas that have some access to the Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea or whatever, the Red Sea as well, a means of having fresh water because the price of desal is going down. I'm on the science committee, and I can tell you that the new inventions by Lockheed of use of graphene in your system will bring down the cost of energy cost of desal, and thus will bring down the cost dramatically. Whether or not, how long that takes to put in place that type of desal project, and with the energy level that is still required by that, it may or may not come in time. Is there anyone right now involved with trying to mediate or arbitrate a difference between Ethiopia and Egypt?
Well, President El-Sisi has had many discussions with the Ethiopians. There are conciliatory moves, including some trade deals. The rhetoric has been calmed down, certainly since the regime of President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, if water stress comes in an extreme manner to Egypt, there's a very good chance the Brotherhood will come back, because it will be a failure for General El-Sisi, President El-Sisi. There are many people trying to find some middle ground here.
Is there any international organization that we have now that we can call upon to do that?
Well, there's the Nile Basin Initiative.
Right.
And
is that seeking to mediate, or is that or to arbitrate this dispute, or is it just there to try to facilitate communication?
Facilitate communication. It's also rather toothless on this one. Oh. When you have two countries that are at odds, it's very difficult to find a middle ground. The United States may act as a convener in some place distant from their two countries.
So you would think the United States, we could step forward and offer both of these countries to play a mediation role or an arbitration role?
We could, and it also may be a way to repair some of the damage to U.S.-Egyptian relations that occurred with the cutting back of military aid in a time when they needed it the most, and then they turned to Russia, which right now seems to be a problematic country for the United States.
That happened with a dam in the past, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. That would be the Aswan High Dam. But desalinization, getting back to that doesn't seem to me to be sufficient, and it certainly would take time to ramp this thing up.
Well, it certainly wouldn't be sufficient in the Central Asian republics because they're not near the ocean at all. Let's just note that we did convince the Ethiopians at one point to agree to arbitration of a major dispute that they were in with Eritrea. And this has happened during the last administration, so you know this is not a partisan remark, but I thought the behavior of our government in that whole episode was disgraceful and has undermined our ability to arbitrate other disputes, in the sense that Ethiopia, the decision of the arbitrators went against Ethiopia in their border dispute with Eritrea, and we extracted some kind of other deal with them to help us with some sort of defense-related deal, and let them off the hook. Basically said they didn't have to follow their arbitration, which meant that the message to all of Africa was, you better skip out the arbitration because that just doesn't work. Even the Americans are going to discard it. What the result is, that was very sad. I would hope that we could come up with someone who could help arbitrate between Ethiopia and Egypt on this. Your testimony is, from what I take from your testimony, is that if the Ethiopians do take a longer period of filling this dam up with water, a long period of time, it may not be harmful. It's possible that both sides could actually come out of this okay, as long as the Ethiopians were filling their dam in a responsible way. Is that correct?
When you're in a country such as Egypt, which is using 98% of its water, there's only a 2% leeway there. And to see only 2% reduction is probably a low probability event. When they're filling this thing up, they want to fill it up as quickly as possible. Yes, there is a possibility for negotiating a slow fill, but in order to not damage Egypt, it would have to be over many, many years.
That should be something that maybe they could be negotiated, perhaps.
Perhaps, but it also leaves Ethiopia in a position of controlling the water tap. If at any time it needs to control that water for the next famine, for the next drought, and then Egypt is shut off. During the 1980s, 1984 in particular, Egypt was damaged from this, and there wasn't even a dam there. Egypt is possibly in a much riskier situation now that this spigot is there, which a hydro dam can be, and you add an irrigation, it gets even worse.
I think that we have got to be very sensitive to that, to make sure that that outcome does not happen. The Egyptian government right now is pivotal to peace in that region, and for us to, the people of Egypt have to know that the United States, the people of the United States are on their side in making sure that they do not wake up one morning and find the actions of another government, whether it's Ethiopia or whoever, has dramatically negatively impacted on their economic well-being. So today I would just call on our government, the United States government, to do what it can to make sure that the Egyptian people are never put in that spot where a decision made in Ethiopia or some other government will bring their economic well-being down, their standard of living down, cause suffering among their people. That is unacceptable as an alternative. Hopefully the United States, our government, will take that as a priority and try to solve this problem in some sort of role that we can play, which I'll leave to you to answer again on the second round. I now, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to compliment the witnesses for the breadth of what they've covered in that short period that they addressed this. One thing that struck me, let's talk on the demand side for a second, because I think it was Dr. Kunast who was mentioning the comparison between some Central Asian countries and China, for instance, where the amount consumed per person is 14 times what it is there, and it's 4 times more than in the U.S. What areas of demand can be addressed to be helpful, if that's the case? I understand some of that's just water mismanagement itself, but also what can be done to make those ratios more in line? Certainly China has enormous challenges in this area too, and they seem to be doing better.
Well, I would clarify that each of these states are so different and difficult to characterize them all as Central Asia. In this case, it was Turkmenistan. I think, one of the problems that we're all talking about is agricultural use, and there is great demand. You also have a legacy of the Soviet period that wanted to grow rice in this part of the world, that does grow cotton, as you know, takes a lot of water, grows potatoes and wheat, but all of these are great drain. And what you have simultaneously is countries coming into their own economic processes, and they're needing to pivot an entire generation from agricultural practices to service, to business. And that is taking a generation at least, because suddenly not having the Soviet system in place for education, it is like retooling everybody. And so some of it is systemic from the Soviet legacy, and some of it is how do you help turn a country toward a forward-looking process of business and other kinds of forms of economic development.
You've also touched on emergencies and disasters. Certainly disasters, natural disasters like earthquakes that can cause problems, or terrorist acts can cause problems as well. What's being done on the international community to reduce the destabilizing effects of this kind of water-related event? Any ideas? Is there any planning on that, or are we just sitting there waiting for one of these things to happen? Dr. Sullivan?
There's a lot of talk. Talk. Not much action and no enforcement. That's the answer.
So the answer is we are at great risk to those type of disasters, and we're not prepared for that.
I could add to that if I
Yes.
could. There are a number of programs for dealing with emergency energy needs in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in particular. So the United Nations and World Bank has a number of programs, and USAID has been connected to and supporting some of that. In terms of natural disaster institutional strengthening, in Kyrgyzstan, it's actually a pretty interesting case of improvement where the Ministry for Emergency Services was actually strengthened and visibly improved its ability to monitor, map, and prevent some of those impacts from natural disasters, mostly from landslides and from earthquakes. Also, there was a good support and implementation from that ministry to build the capacity in local communities and vulnerable locations. So I'd say that that's a really actually an interesting impact, one of the most valuable impacts of aid in the region. And that ministry has worked to coordinate with ministries across the wider region in mapping and monitoring the potential impacts.
I can't let my time go without mentioning global warming. And you know,
I knew it.
Dr. Wooden touched on this with glacial decline. But to what extent is global warming and climate change, what extent will they contribute to the potential for conflict over water resources, and how can countries come together to address the larger impact of this phenomenon? Do you have any examples?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, because you mentioned glacial.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. The research is pretty clear that there has been a decline in the 20th and early 21st century in glacial coverage. This will impact water supply. So the regional leaders know that. Everyday people talk about it. This is a kind of a known thing there, and thinking about adapting is part of the conversation. I think it's an interesting moment for potential cooperation over this. Right now, it's a source of tension and concern because it's an uncertainty. Exactly what will those precipitation patterns look like? It's pretty unclear. So thinking about ways in which we can engage to support addressing that is probably one of the most important steps we can take for the future of water supply. And it's a fear right now, right? So the discussion about climate change in the region is about this uncertainty.
It's dynamic, too, because it's just not about precipitation change. It's also flooding and other issues that result.
Yes, and temperature changes. So there's the latest IPCC report had a number of instances, I think something like 6 or 7, indicating specific changes in Central Asia that include temperature changes that are already impacting the growing season that interacts with what's happening in the Aral Sea. So their interaction, I don't think that conflict will happen directly, but as we've all outlined, that kind of step to migration, for example, is one of the most important next social impacts. Where will people move to if glaciers decline? The fastest declining glaciers in the region are the lowest lying, smallest glaciers closest to population centers. That's where we see that already happening, right? And so will people move from those locations because in agriculturally dependent communities, and what will that migration mean?
We didn't touch too much on international aquifers as an issue, but I think they are another concern that we should have, and many of them are facing serious declines as well, not just with groundwater decline, but with contamination. Can you just discuss what can be done and what's being done with that, particularly in agricultural areas.
Well, if I might say something on the issue that she just touched upon, think about the following 300 to 400 million people that are reliant on the Tibetan Plateau glaciers, and those glaciers might be melting. And that includes 3 nuclear states, Pakistan, India, and China. With regard to the aquifers, there's a very interesting aquifer in North Africa, the Great Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, which has 150 trillion cubic meters of water in it. Muhammad Gaddafi, you remember him? He started something called the Great Man-Made River to bring that water to the coastline to green Libya. At the same time, Egypt is tapping into the fossil water. This is 40 to 60,000 year old water as an alternative source of fresh water. Once you take that stuff out, it's non-replenishable. There's no rain. The Saudis grew wheat in the desert. The first time I flew over Saudi Arabia was in 1980, coming back from Bombay, India, writing my PhD at the time. I saw these green circles. What's this all about? Growing wheat in the desert, using the underground aquifer of non-replenishable water. Overall cost about 11 times to grow the wheat than in Kansas. That was a waste. They figured it out. They changed the program. But when people don't see what's underground, they don't really think about it. And when water's free, just take it up. When the only cost of water to you is the diesel fuel to pump the water out of the ground. But on the other side of the story, being from New England, you know how big New England is. We all do. Underneath Darfur, there is a huge lake of water the size of New England, sometimes 300 meters deep. But on top of that underground aquifer, people are dying of thirst. We have to understand the situation a lot better.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's interesting because what you just talked about, Mr. Sullivan, I mean, what's striking to me is, as I said in my opening, there was a presentation on 60 Minutes just this past weekend, and they were showing how deep in the ground, in California, not in places that we're talking about where folks are starving, but in California where the farmers are utilizing this groundwater and pumping it up, just using the same machines as if they were digging for oil, and how the groundwater is now going down, I think they said a foot every month now. But the farmers claimed that they need it, and they were drilling more holes, etc. But we've got places where folks are starving, and they need the water to drink, and or, you know, you talked about what took place in Egypt. So how do we balance the need for preserving the water and juxtapose it to those individuals who need water to drink, you know, clean water to drink, or and that's clearly, you know, sanitation wise, etc. How do we juxtapose? We do that in working with these countries so that they can survive. You know, it's easy for sometimes for folks to come from the United States to say we can do this because we have, you know, we're feeding our people, etc. They're in a different circumstance, so that we can survive, they can survive, but we also understand the precious resources because we all are interrelated in that regards. How do we differentiate between the two? Dr. Cunas?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, we need good data, and that needs to be shared in a transparent way from the ground level to the political elite as such. But even more so, some of what we have to do is change daily habits, and that needs very astute social marketing efforts. And that's why I emphasize this, that we need first critical problem-solving skills of the people who live there. And second, how can we market that kind of change of behavior? Because they came out of a legacy where all things were free, where there were no incentives to save. And you have to change human behavior first to get at, bridging the gap between the Darfur example so eloquently laid out here and the water underneath. We need that bridge work, critical thinking skill, incentive programs for young people to help solve their own issues. I loved what you said about really it's not only sharing, but preserving water for the future. How do you motivate young people to get at that problem and that helps them solve their future issues?
Well, a lot of this has to do with knowledge and data, I would agree. We really don't know what the groundwater is like in many parts of the world. But also, how many people know what their water footprint is? 2 kilograms of beef takes 15,701 or thereabout liters of water. And yet, a similar amount of protein through vegetables would be about 1,700 liters of water. The way we eat, we have countries growing very quickly. China, for example, they're moving toward pork and beef, more water-intensive ways of doing things. Energy systems, some are more water-intensive than others. The worst is biofuels, by far, irrigated biofuels. Absolutely water nonsense when it comes to that, particularly in a country with low amounts of water. Getting back to Ethiopia, instead of hydro dams causing all of this trouble, they have massive geothermal reserves in that country, which will use less water. They have significant solar energy potential, wind energy potential, many other potentials in that country that could be used without causing all of this trouble. At least 7 gigawatts of geothermal could be rolled out in the next few years. They're on the Rift Valley. Geothermal is a really great place when you're near hot rocks in the ground. Just north of San Francisco in your state, there's a city that's run by geothermal, Calpine geysers. Geothermal in the world is a small percentage of what it could be. Japan could turn around to geothermal. Many countries could turn around. In this country, the biggest use of water is not irrigation. It's thermoelectric cooling. Thermoelectric cooling. And California is facing this as a big problem right now. And many countries looking to develop their energy systems the way we did are going to have to rethink it if they have water stress. Nuclear power plants, the same thing. How do you cool them down? With water.
And let me ask, I think Dr. Wooden said this, that I'm just interested in the statement. You said that think bilateral agreements as opposed to multilateral agreements were more effective. And my way of thinking initially was that in a region you wanted, because it could be interconnected between 2 or 3 different countries, that you'd want multilateral agreements. I was wondering if you could give me some further clarification on why bilateral is more successful than multilateral.
It's interesting in Central Asia, the relationship over these 2 rivers has been joined. It's part of the Soviet legacy, and in the post-Soviet period, initially in cooperation that actually was enhanced by joint concern about the Aral Sea decline. So we actually saw in the 1990s a number of high-level meetings between leaders of the countries in the region establishing an institutional framework that was rather complex, that united all decisions across the region and made it difficult to separate out the individual rivers. And so when tensions exist between 2 countries among the 5, and 6 if we include Afghanistan, makes progress in the rest of the basin difficult. And so that's why the suggestion by the international community is moved towards, okay, let's break this down and work on those bilateral relationships. And some of them have moved forward. I mentioned a couple of them, like the Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan relationship, and they're not perfect. They had a little bit of a spat over water in 2010 when Kazakhstan closed the borders after the violence in Osh, and Kyrgyzstan well, there were some canals that were cut off for a little bit of time, and Kazakhstan then reopened the borders. So those bilateral relationships don't always work perfectly, but they have allowed some improvements, for example, in funding of infrastructure improvements in Kyrgyzstan from Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan and China are experimenting with this as well. So there are ways of breaking down the complexity of the relationship to smaller bilateral agreements that also deal with some of the border delimitation issues, for example, or the enclave disputes. And so we're building cooperation also is demonstrating that it's possible in one part of the basin. That doesn't mean that the future moving towards multilateral agreements should be avoided. That would be preferable. But until that's functioning, yes.
And my last question would be, I haven't heard in the testimony much, and I know we in the United States have to do our part. We have to do a lot. But I didn't hear, what about the roles, you think, in regards to the United Nations, the World Bank, or other international efforts to address these freshwater conflicts? Do they have should they play a significant role, or do you just not have confidence in them? Because I haven't heard about, again, it's a global context of which we're talking, and so I think that we need help, but I wonder, your positions on those.
I can mention that when it comes to the RLC, many people are greatly disappointed in the limitations of the international community to assist in stopping the process of the collapse of this ecosystem. This was the focus of my dissertation, evaluating regional engagement on the RLC basin. And the most successful efforts, it actually surprised me, were by US aid. And that was because the engagements were small. And spending a lot of money in a really difficult political situation is challenging. And I think that the efforts are also sometimes incorrect. So, for example, the World Bank helped fund the construction of the Kok Aral Dam, which divides the small Aral at the north part of the sea from the larger Aral. And this was done because of the intractability of dealing with Uzbekistan's government, primarily, in addressing wider issues such as changing cotton production for reducing irrigation use. And so the World Bank, and when appealed to by the Kazakhstani government, agreed to construct this dam. And it worked to increase the levels of water in the small northern part of the Aral. But it drastically sped up the decline of the rest of the lake, and so this summer it no longer exists, in part because of that sped up process. So this dam is used as an example of success. But it's also, when we take this whole ecosystem, we break it up in parts. I just suggested doing so, right? But there are ramifications of doing that. And so continuing to make sure we understand clearly, if we engage in economic growth in the textile sector, what does that mean for cotton production in the wider region? We need to be aware of those ramifications.
The World Bank, the World Bank has been involved with this, but is not involved with the GERD because they have not received an environmental impact statement or an economic or social impact statement, which they require. The GERD is actually being paid for by bonds that are being sold to the Ethiopian public at between 1.5 and 2.5%. There are NGOs that are really doing very good work in the small. WaterDart.org with Matt Damon is doing great stuff in Africa. 5,000 children under the age of 5 die every day in sub-Saharan Africa because of dirty water. You want to make friends and influence people? Clean up the water.
Thank you very much for that admonition. I think we should all take that to heart. About the point you made before that, however, was about the financing of a particular dam. Who is financing the Rogan and the Renaissance dams? Who's financing that? These are two dams where the major contention could end up resulting in conflict. Who's financing this?
When I say the GERD, I mean the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That's the one with the bonds. Sorry, I should have been clearer.
The World Bank and the others?
The World Bank is not involved. The IFC is not involved. USAID and the United States give Ethiopia about 500 million a year. There's a leverage there. It's mostly being paid for by statement of the Ethiopian government, by the Ethiopian government, but they're paying for it with debt. This is a country with a $50 billion GDP, and this dam alone is $5 billion.
Who's paying, who's buying the debt?
Ethiopian expats, Ethiopians who live in the country. China's involved with the turbines. China is involved with the electricity system connections. But they don't have enough money in the country, is my guess, to do what the Egyptians did with the Suez Canal. No way.
I will have to tell you that you're not giving me a certainty answer. The Ethiopian expats are buying all these bonds.
And people inside the country.
Yeah,
They have embassy locations throughout the world. I know that sounds odd.
it does sound
because
odd
they
for a
couldn't
country that's
find-
impoverished for them to be able to
I know,
buy
but
bonds.
with the Suez Canal, the Egyptians collected 66 billion Egyptian pounds, about $10 billion to build that.
That seems a little more doable than
Yeah.
the Ethiopian people who mainly live in poverty.
Okay, so now you see my lack of believing in some of the policies of the Ethiopian government when they're doing something like this and they're saying this.
Yeah.
This is problematic.
Yeah, well, let me just, somebody's making money on it there. as
No
well.
kidding.
Yeah, no. By the way, just to mention geothermal, however, there have been drawbacks to geothermal, and that is, we tried that in California. There we have a large amount of geothermal, and they may have solved that problem now technologically. I'll have to go back and take a look, but it destroyed the pipes went through a degeneration of the pipe and the material very quickly, and geothermal didn't meet its promise, let's put it that way, because there's a lot of calculation on that early on. Now, maybe they've cured that problem without me knowing it, but I will check into it because I should know that. About a couple of points, we'll do just a second round very quickly, and with all due respect, I don't think we necessarily disagree on global warming. The issue that mainly is at hand, the temperature is what the temperature is, and the impacts that people measure are there. The question is whether human activity through CO2 is causing the change in the climate. We have been through climate changes throughout the history of this planet, and the only question is the one we're at, is that caused by human beings? And if it is, my colleagues who believe that are totally justified in trying to control the behavior of human beings through government action. If you don't think that it's human beings, you end up spending enormous amounts of money and controlling people's lives, basically when you should be trying to find ways of dealing with the fact that you are now in a cycle of history that will leave with less water and affect the glaciers, etc. Rather than trying to control people's lives, you're trying to remediate, I guess is the word I'm looking for, the effects, the bad impacts on that. And it sounds like we're in for some time when we may face water shortages because of one part of the cycle or something that we're being caused by having too many automobiles. But whatever it is, it's there. And when countries like Egypt try to deal with it, and Ethiopia try to deal with it, and Central Asia, we need to put in place something, not just the answer to how we're going to lessen the suffering that may come from this, but also perhaps a way that we can put in place something that will deal with the conflicts that happen between peoples that wouldn't exist had that change in climate or the change in the status quo not happen. We don't seem to have that. I haven't been getting that from you today as to there is something in place. Maybe we need to focus on trying to have some international mediation board or arbitration board that's signed on to any nations that have conflict, and that everybody else agrees that at that point they will respect the rights, and they will respect those nations that go ahead and go along with whatever the decision is. That's one idea, and maybe there's some other ideas of how we can help countries become more efficient in the use of water and things such as that. If you have just one or two comments on that, then I will let Mr. Keating finish up with his questions.
On the Rogun Dam question you asked about, there's ongoing considerations about from the Tajikistani government about how to attract more funding, and the government has in the past sought to collect funds, force funding collection from citizens. So there's some controversy about how the funding's been raised and whether or not funding will be forthcoming to complete the project. So that's definitely part of the discussion. Regarding the possibilities of dealing with the conflicts that are produced, respectfully, I think that just like in the Aral Sea situation, if we don't actually tackle the causes of the problem, if we think about temperature changes, precipitation changes, glacial decline, there are, in the latest IPCC report, tens of thousands of academic articles evaluated to identify pretty clearly, very clearly, the pattern and the cause of anthropogenic impact, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions on climate change. So we know what the causes are. There's scientific certainty.
Let me just note for the record that being a member, the vice chairman of the science committee, that is only your opinion and the opinion of others. There's a lot of other opinions as well.
Well, I actually don't think it's an opinion. This is scientific
whether or not
correct?
it's caused by human beings or whether it's caused by a natural cycle, as I said, I don't think that's as relevant as would be, except you want to aim your solutions at what will have a good impact.
Right, I agree, aiming the solutions at what will have a good impact, but we have to get at the heart of the problem. And we've been asked to come here as experts in the region,
Right.
and plenty of experts on climatology have evaluated the problem. So if we think about then how to deal with conflict, just like with the Aral Sea issue, the Aral Sea problem was cotton production. If we think about dealing with the problems of water supply, there are ways of changing the uses of water, the ways of dealing with water pollution, for example, that makes the available water all capable of use, right? I mean, those are really important issues to tackle that we forget when we talk about trying to increase supply in other ways. Well, we actually have to make sure that we have adequate quality of the water that exists. So that's why we can talk about those kinds of causes and address those.
And Dr. Sullivan, in his admonition to us about, if we're really concerned about people's lives, those 5,000 kids dying like that with from bad water, sometimes, and people have build these grandiose projects with the dam in Ethiopia, when I've been told if we just would focus on making sure that the people in those villages have a way of purifying their water in sometimes very simple ways, but we have to take the initiative to go out and make certain things available, that would be much better than these grandiose dam projects.
Couldn't agree with you more on this. There's something called SODIS, S-O-D-I-S, out of Switzerland, where very poor people can actually use the typical plastic bottle, filter a little bit, and put it on top of a tin shack, heat the water, and get rid of most of the bacteria. And then there's Life Straw, which is pretty inexpensive. This could be handed out. But this is kind of person to person. Another way of getting at this, particularly in remote communities, is to have solar water pumps or wind water pumps, getting the cleaner water up from the aquifer. The problem with dying from dirty water is that they're digging this out of open pit wells where the donkeys and other animals, you can take a guess at what happens, and people wash, and it's happening in rivers and so forth. But there are simple answers to this. If you take a look at the $5 billion being used to build this dam and put it toward cleaning water for under 5 children in Africa, you could save many American football stadiums full of African kids every single year.
And did you have one last
Well,
comment
I'd
to
just
that?
like to underline again that, we need creative, context-specific solutions. These 5 countries in Central Asia all have different water and energy dynamics. One shoe does not fit all. But, I'm interested in the fact that Dr. Wooden said USAID's project in the Aral Sea seemed to have impact because it was locally driven. And I think so often we are attracted by the massive engineering of a dam or a road or whatever else that we lose track of the everyday efforts or technology, low-level technology that could make a difference. And we need to incentivize that approach, and
Well-
that's my suggestion.
Well said, because the incentive now is for some big companies to make a lot of money building these huge projects. Mr. Keating?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just comment on some of the takeaways I get from today's hearing, and you can comment as you may or may wish to or may not. But the one thing it seems clear is that we don't have enough data. And to me, if we're going to work with water management or mismanagement, and we're going to deal with this issue, we seem to have a consensus among all 3 of you that this is a primary need. And without that, we're not able to move constructively. That brings me back briefly, we won't dwell on it, to the importance of realizing, as the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has, and thousands of reports, that climate change, 99% of all the scientists that are polled agree that climate change is man-made, and without having that basic understanding, it's going to be hard to deal with that data once we get that, or even accumulate that data. So I think it's a threshold issue we have to deal with. But I want to tell you, I feel optimistic after today's hearing, because there's so much we can do. This thing is not a problem that's in any stretch insurmountable or difficult if we approach it the right way. And so I came away learning that, some fundamental issues about, what you grow for agricultural products and where you grow it, even what we eat, are all things that have a very strong impact on our water resources in this world. I think I mentioned just once that the government can get involved, and the U.S. government is involved in many ways. A smaller project with the Millennium Challenge in Capo Verde, we put $41 million to establish transparent water delivery and sanitation systems for that area. And so we can, use some of our financial resources in that respect as well. And I'll finally just comment on, and Dr. Sullivan was stealing some of my thunder on this, but in my own district, we had a military base where there was water contamination from the utilization of that. And it was a major problem. And it's being cleaned up. And the energy to clean that up is being generated through wind power. So, and I also have municipalities in my district that I've gone around during this break, and I've seen how they're using solar and wind power in those communities to provide the energy for wastewater cleanup and for even the delivery of their own water supply. So there's a real, need, I think, because if you're doing the trade-offs to clean up the water and to do this produces energy, takes energy, but we can do that if we commit to renewables, I think, and using it for that purpose. And it's working in my district as we speak. So I'm coming away very hopeful on many fronts, but we do have to start with getting the data and getting the information. And that's something one country can't do itself. That's something that's going to need international cooperation with in terms of access and getting our scientists all on the same page and our engineers all on the same page. And then we can approach this. So that's, again, getting back to my introductory remarks, Mr. Chairman, why this committee has, I think, done a great service by, again, bringing up this issue that not only affects a global conflict, but our survival and our sustenance going forward. So thank you very much. If any of you want to comment on those things, you're free to.
When I think of many of the things that we talked about today, I sometimes think of the little children I've seen in Egypt in my years living there. Wonder what's going to happen to them if the water gets short. What happens to the women and the girls and the older people who need that water more than others? And also, how will this affect the development of terrorism and strife and the return of the Brotherhood? Ethiopia really needs to commit publicly how quickly they're going to fill up this dam, by how much, and when, and have some cooperation with Egypt and others involved to try to resolve the tensions here. They need to do the same with Kenya for the Omo River. There has to be some precedence set to find a civilized, reasonable way of solving these issues without conflict, because it goes right back to those little kids in the street in Cairo.
I would like to add on the data sharing issue or the data collection issue that in part it's to understand some of these processes are happening, to be able to understand them well, for us here to understand them, for decision makers in the region to know what is happening in the future. But also, data sharing is an important part of intergovernmental relations, right? I mean, it's one of the biggest problems we have between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. That is that transparency about these processes, ability to predict mutually understood change and how to adapt to it as it's happening is very important. I mean, the understanding of how we can monitor from satellite imagery, monitor groundwater changes in California, it's been really important for our ability to withstand, in a significant drought, withstand severe political ramifications, right? That's what we're talking about happening in Central Asia. A big part of this is just being able to make this whole process transparent. So I think funding of research is one of the most crucial steps we can take to tackle this and to generate cooperation. We've already talked about cooperation as happening more commonly, right? So there's much to build on here in the relationships between communities on the border and between governments. And we can really begin by just listening to leaders, but community leaders at the local level for what they need. Most people in the region are concerned about water as the primary issue. We both have found this in our surveys of the region, that water pollution and water supply are our primary concerns. So people know what the issues are worried about them, and want to work together to tackle them. So mainly through improved understanding of what's happening.
I would like to say that indeed transparency of information is critical, but what you need is the investment of the young people in this 5-country region with a sense of hope, with a sense that they can apply good knowledge with excellent business and technological acumen and help solve their problems, help strengthen and build capacity at the local level. And I think you'll see more wind farms, more solar energy, more direct person-to-person and technology advancements that are really responsive to the issues. And in doing so, you will prevent conflict because you give people the sense that they can take care of this themselves and that they're empowered to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And just a note that, again, I want to say very clearly that the United States is watching Ethiopia's activities and decisions on this dam project. We're watching very closely. We would expect, if Ethiopia is acting responsibly, that it commit itself to publicly to a policy that will ensure that they are not doing a project that will benefit them at the expense of the people of Egypt, but instead will try to work and hopefully work with the Egyptians to find water solutions that do not harm large numbers of other people who happen to live across the border or downstream from you. And the Ethiopian government better understand that, or there will be major retaliation from this Congress on Ethiopia for that type of hostile act toward the people of Egypt. In terms of Central Asia, I would hope that Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, as well as these Central Asian countries, will be able to, because they all are dependent on water. I mean, especially with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, should understand this problem. And hopefully they will work together and that there will be a Central Asian cooperative spirit that will put people together to come up with an understanding on this. And maybe we can play a positive role in all of this by thinking about establishing, as your organization is aimed at, trying to find out how we can, as a people, serve as conflict deterrents, and how we can become active in a process of deterring conflict by being arbiters or being people who are, we at least could come in and get the parties together and find ways of reaching agreements between people who have disagreements that might lead to conflict. And water is, of course, one of those major issues. I do believe that we should continue funding. One of the reasons why I'm upset with the focus on human activity is that we've spent billions of dollars trying to determine what will be the impact of global warming, and with the idea of justifying the expenditures on that research. I think that we should instead have research into finding ways that are going to make people's lives better, that will actually be able to offer some sort of impact on those people's lives there, whether it's the water pollution devices that Dr. Sullivan talked about, or other types of technologies that will permit people in Africa to cheaply get to cleaner water, which seems to be better than building huge dam projects, etc. But again, whether or not it's caused by human beings or whether it's caused by, but one last note, that 99-cent figure has been disproven over and over and over again. 99% of the scientists do not agree that mankind is causing this change in the climate. It's a majority, however, do agree with you and disagree with me, but not 99%. And with that said, I want to thank the witnesses. We've had a very good discussion, and I have really always felt that there are two major important things for people to be able to have a planet where ordinary people are going to live decent lives. We've got to have energy, and hopefully clean energy, and we've got to have water. And with those two things, I think human beings and human ingenuity will be able to overcome a lot of other things and develop the agriculture, et cetera, that we need. But without those two fundamental things in play, ordinary people won't live well. So I think the United States should be committed to clean energy and water for the world. Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.
Good hearing.